Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Get Married and Have Kids, Examining Cultural and Economic Policies for Strengthening Families event. My name is Hannah Bruck, and I'm a policy scholar who works on family policy here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. It's a privilege to have you with us today as we discuss one of the most important foundations of national well-being, the American family. We all recognize that family structure and stability are deeply intertwined with both culture and economics. Policies like the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program were designed to promote work, responsibility, and self-sufficiency. Yet nearly 3 decades later, questions remain about how well our current systems align with the realities that families face today. We'll also examine the so-called success sequence, finishing education, working full-time, and marrying before having children, and explore its empirical strengths as well as the social complexities that are associated with it. We'll continue then to look at how cultural norms, economic incentives, and policy design can either reinforce or erode the conditions that help families thrive. Our goal today is not simply to critique programs, but to think seriously about what a 21st century family policy framework should look like. One that respects culture, rewards effort, and ultimately strengthens opportunity across generations. We're joined by an exceptional panel who bring expertise across economics, sociology, and public policy. To my left is Katie McLeod, who is a family policy director for the San Antonio Marriage Initiative. She's held several positions across the nonprofit and government sectors, including stints as policy and budget analyst for 2 governors of Colorado, as contractor and consultant to several nonprofit organizations, and as project coordinator to 2 policy institutions. Katie received a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College and a master's degree in public policy from Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She, her husband, and their 5 daughters recently moved to Texas and are enjoying life in the Lone Star State. Brad Wilcox is a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia and is the director for the National Marriage Project. He's the author of a book titled Get Married: Why Americans Should Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. Wilcox studies marriage, fatherhood, and the impact of strong and stable families on men, women, and children. He is also the co-author and author of 6 books total and has written for many scientific journals. His research has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, National Review Online, NPR, NBC's The Today Show, and many other media outlets. Wilcox consults regularly with companies such as Nestle, Procter & Gamble, and Kimberly-Clark on fertility and marriage trends in the United States. As an undergraduate, he was a Jefferson Scholar at the University of Virginia and later earned his PhD from Princeton University. Prior to coming to the University of Virginia, he held research fellowships at Princeton University, Yale, and the Brookings Institution. Mariana Orlandi is the executive director and director of academic programs at the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture. She received her PhD in law from the University of Padua, Italy, and from the University of Innsbruck, Austria. Prior to moving to Texas, she was a 2019 to 2022 James Madison Associate Research Scholar and lecturer in the Department of Politics at Princeton University. She was admitted to the Italian bar in 2015 after graduating magna cum laude from the University of Padua. She practiced as a criminal lawyer in Milan and worked in the United States as a policy research analyst. Her interests and research focus on issues of life and its legal and international protection, in particular through the lens of criminal law. Since 2020, and prior to becoming our executive director, Dr. Orlandi directs the academic programming of the Austin Institute, where she contributes both as a speaker and a teacher, as well as a mentor for students. Rounding out this panel is Noah Torres, who is a policy analyst with the Center for Health and Families here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Noah focuses on marriage and family formation policy, as well as healthcare antitrust regulation and enforcement. He was born in Fort Worth, Texas, and attended the University of Dallas, where he earned his bachelor's in politics and theology and his master's in political theory. Since grad school, Noah has participated in conversations on the influence of Romano, canonical, and Spanish scholastic legal traditions on American jurisprudence and politics, publishing extensively on Francisco de Vitoria, his theory of right and justice, and the work of his students. Particularly relevant during his graduate work, he researched conceptions of the family and relations between its members in early civil modern law. He's participated in work groups from the U.S. Department of State, UK Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Religious Freedom, and he's also produced university-level curricula on virtue ethics for nationwide usage. I'm sure you're all tired of hearing the sound of my voice, so I'd love for you to hear from our distinguished panelists, starting with Noah.
Is this working? There we go. Alrighty. Well, thank y'all again for joining. Happy to be here. Again, Noah Torres, policy analyst here. And to start us off, I just wanted to give a brief note about setting the stage with the historical, legal, and political conceptions of marriage. When we talk about the present, when we talk about issues with marriage now, it is important that we look into the future with a glance to the past. And when we look into the glance of the past, we can't simply wax and wane nostalgic, but it's important for us to understand the foundations and how we got here today. Because every instance in legal history and political history relating to family and marriage influences how we got here. So, Hannah, I don't want to take up too much time. If you would like to discuss this part a little bit later, or would you like me to just introduce this and continue?
Brief is fine. We'll get into it later.
Okay.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you. It's amazing to be on this panel. It's amazing to be at TPPF. You're doing great work that I often consider parallel to the one we do at the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture that I have the honor to direct, and I've had the honor to direct for the past 3 years. Briefly, what do I want to say? We have a crisis. We would not have this panel otherwise. And it feels very weird to say that because when I was in college, many, many years ago, it sounded like the problem was the opposite. You know, careful. Don't get pregnant, don't get married, get your degree first. It was only 20, 25 years ago. Of course, what I was hearing was not what Professor Ignaris, who was the president of the Austin Institute, and Brett Wilcox, too, were already saying 20 years ago. The problem we're facing today is not a new problem. We've seen it coming, which is why the Austin Institute was funded in 2013. 2013, 2015, you know, it's a year some of you might remember, but 2013 was a time where nobody wanted to talk about the family, nobody wanted to talk about marriage, nobody wanted to talk about children. Some people did, you know, I said nobody, some people did. Definitely the person sitting on my right did, and definitely Professor Regnerus did. Now, in his expertise, the president of my institute has dealt with the crisis of the family, linking it to sexual promiscuity. He has long had the argument that to fix marriage, we need to fix the sex market. That's how he calls it. And I personally agree with this view. However, there is a reason our name is the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture. We can fix sexual behaviors. We can fix what he calls the sex market. But the problem that we faced with marriage and with family did not happen in a vacuum. There is a cultural problem. There's a very profound cultural problem. I will say something about it if I can, but what I want to say now is that young people today are distracted so much that they're not thinking, we are not thinking, although I'm not that one of those young anymore, but like about aging, about our finitude, and we also have a huge problem understanding that our reason has the capacity to guide our feelings. These are cultural problems, and this is why the Austin Institute exists. And I think that's enough.
Thank you, Hannah, for having us here today. I would say, just to kind of get the ball rolling here from my vantage point, is that we've been documenting at the Institute for Family Studies kind of what we would call kind of like the closing of the American heart in some ways unfolding for adults. And so I think the bad news that we're all kind of struggling with is the way in which we've seen a dramatic decline in dating and marriage and fertility in recent years. Just to kind of give you one statistic that gives you a sense of what that means for real young adults today is that we are now projecting that 1 in 3, fully 1 in 3 young adults today in their 20s will never marry. And we've never been in a place in our country where there are going to be so many people kind of moving through the adult life course without having had the benefit of a husband or a wife. So that's kind of one indicator of the bad news that we've been chronicling. But there's good news too in terms of just the way in which family is stabilizing in America. More and more kids are being raised by their own stable married parent families, and divorce actually is down 40% since 1980. So there are some points of good news to point to as well as we have this conversation today about kind of the state of marriage and family in America, and then here in Texas more particularly.
Thank you, Hannah. Is this on? Yeah. Thank you for having us at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We're glad to be here. I work for the Marriage Initiative. And as we have been hearing, and we all know that the restoration of the family is the single most effective way that we're going to solve the social ills of America. And at the Marriage Initiative, we've been looking at the how question. How can states support healthy family formation? We've been looking particularly through the lens of TANF, which is the Federal Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or what was previously welfare. We've been looking at that program to see how it supports healthy family formation. And we've particularly been looking at a couple states that have been doing this work for 25 years, who have had marriage initiatives and marriage commissions to try to reinvigorate the culture of marriage in their states. So we're just trying to look at the idea of prevention and how can states and policies, promising programs, support and reinvigorate the culture of marriage in their state, looking particularly at these two states. And there's reason for hope. There's some promising things, and we've developed some resources, and we're hopeful that state policymakers in Texas, maybe beyond, can look in a more preventative way for how we can, reinforce the family before they need the foster care, the child welfare, the juvenile justice, and the criminal justice systems.
Great, thank you for those opening statements. I kind of want to kick us off with a little bit of a broader lens. Dr. Wilcox and Dr. Orlandi, over the past few decades, how have cultural norms around marriage, childbearing, and cohabitation shifted? And what's kind of driving these cultural changes? Dr. Wilcox, maybe starting with you.
So I think we see, obviously, the 1960s, late 60s, and the 70s, a kind of turn towards what we call kind of individual expressivism and away from a kind of more familistic mindset. So it's much more about what I want to do, what I desire, and much less about kind of what's good for my family, my marriage, my spouse. And this is connected to, obviously, a whole bunch of shifts that were taking place in the 60s and 70s. So it kind of pushes a lot of Americans away from embracing marriage and family, and also kind of towards what we would sort of view as the easy divorce, where kind of like divorce is just becoming much more common in this era. So that's part of the story. And then I think more recently we've seen what I call kind of the rise of the Midas mindset, where people have kind of, I think, the idea that what really matters in life is making money, getting a good degree, and especially having a satisfying career. And they're kind of discounting the importance in how they're living their life of prioritizing love, marriage, and family. And the problem with that is that what we see in the data is that Americans who are married are markedly happier, and they're reporting markedly more meaningful lives, and that's also true for parents as well. And so in particular, what we're seeing is that today, people who are single and childless are not just sort of worse off emotionally, but they're increasingly worse off. I think that's in part because of the rise of the digital revolution that has kind of left a lot of Americans much more isolated, much more technologically distracted. And so for Americans who are single and childless, I think they're more likely to be sort of caught up in that revolution. And so again, the point is that, a lot of the cultural currents have de-emphasized marriage and family life at precisely the moment when they're actually more valuable than they once were.
I mean, talking about culture, there would be a lot to say, of course, but staying on the technology part, this last part of unmarried and without children, but with a phone on our hands, that has helped, or done the opposite, help people think that the universe does work around just our own single preferences and needs, right? So I have my meal plan, my alarm clock, my favorite newspaper, like everything is just catered to my own needs. And that coming from, the legal perspective too, if you want, the UN, everyone that is even remotely pro-family knows that, like, everyone repeats, like, family is the fundamental group unity of society. I think we don't think that way. I seriously think that most of the younger people, unmarried, think the individual is the fundamental. And there's no way, and here I don't want to deny, right, the rights of the individual, that, don't get me wrong, but I don't think that the current culture sees the family with the importance that the UN stresses whenever, and that we use whenever we're promoting the family, right? So I think that for people that defend themselves, the family themselves, those words have become sort of meaningless. Now, other driving forces, and I think you can use technology in that, what we are seeing is that young women are less and less willing to have kids of their own. And if I can point to one, so there are the ones, right, they want to, but it's too late, sure. But then younger women are reluctant to the idea of having to go through the pain of pregnancy. So I would say that there is the disembodiment that technology has allowed, has also distanced ourselves from our biology, and again, the limits of our biology.
Kind of expanding on those thoughts, and Noah, expanding on a bit of your opening statement, your work in part has centered on the historical, legal, and political conceptions of marriage and family. What are these conceptions, and what do they mean for us here today?
Absolutely. Thank you, Hannah. So as I was saying earlier, when we look at the past, we can't necessarily wax and wane about nostalgia or looking for a specific time in history where family life was the best. As Marianne Glendon, Harvard Law professor of family law, has noted, in each age we faced a systematic crisis of marriage that has been resolved or encountered via law and policy. So just briefly looking at the history of family law, family relations, the conception of family and political thought, we can go as far back as to Roman legal codes, where we find conceptions of where marriage is between a man and a woman. It is bound by mutual consent. It is for their mutual happiness and their upbringing of their children. By the medieval period, through canon law, we find an increasing maturation development of these concepts. We see the rise of early family courts, of notions of adoption, of parental rights, of the rights of children, procedures to terminate parental rights if in cases of abuse. But in these procedures and in the development of these procedures, we can discern a conception of family and its role in political life. And in many respects, because of the enduring influence of Roman and canon law over civil and common law traditions, these concepts maintain themselves in legal codes and theories of the family and household to this day. So among some of those are, that individuals have subjective rights, parental rights, to individuals can enter into a marriage fully on their own accord without any coercion by any party, that they come together to build a family, to create a family, and that the purpose of this family is to cultivate the friendship between two individuals who in turn, in their mutual love, raise their children to prepare themselves, to prepare these children for entry into society. And this phenomenon, this development over the last 2,000 years is not merely just interesting as legal factoids, but really some of the sociological consequences that have happened. So Joseph Heinrich, a Harvard sociologist, has noted that these conceptions, these legal and political conceptions of marriage and family, have made what he calls societies weird. Weird being Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And the crux of his thesis, and which I think is really true to this day, is that by introducing norms that for all of us here probably seem relatively normal, such as preventing kinship marriage or marrying your second or third cousin, or requiring that a husband and a wife fully consent, it really, introducing these norms broke at a crisis of marriage in the early 900s, 800s AD. And what it was is that these societies were so bound up in tribal blood networks, it was impossible for the individual family of mother and a father to actually raise their kids or even to connect with each other. So by introducing these norms, pro-sociality increased. People were actually encouraged to have their own property, to establish families outside of the homes of their parents, to cultivate their own family life. And therefore, their bonds were not confined to tribal or purely identity matters, but the family that they were raising with their spouse. And Heinrich has noted that, it is discernible to this day that the sociological benefits of this arrangement have persisted, and since it's the arrangement since these characteristics continue to dominate our own conceptions of family and legal thought, these benefits continue, but that we are at a risk, really, at a backsliding of this weirdness of our societies if we if the conceptions of marriage and family begin to go away from this two-parent intact household unit with a married couple raising their kids. So it's really important for us to reflect on the past, to understand that these conceptions have been with us forever and that they have real, true sociological benefit that is observable.
I certainly hope that is what we mean when we say we want to keep Austin weird. A little bit more of an open question here. How do perceptions of spousal and parental self-efficacy, or people's beliefs in their ability to be good spouses and parents, shape family choices? What are some of the key external factors that play into that, or that most influence kind of that sense of self-confidence and self-efficacy? Noah, do you want to kick us off maybe on that?
Sure. So when we talk about self-efficacy, we're not necessarily talking about confidence or one's own self-image, but what we're really talking about is how one assesses their own capacity through comparing themselves with their peers, their friends, their family. And there is relational self-efficacy, and then there is parental self-efficacy. And the individual self-efficacy that an individual has is significantly impacts how they relate to their spouse, how they relate to their child. Studies have shown that anything from, what you grew up seeing as a child, so if your parents fought, you're going to have a lower estimation of your self-efficacy as a future spouse. If you came from a broken home, you may have a lower estimation. As a parent, regardless if you're married or not, with the just swirl and kaleidoscopic notions of what it means to be a good parent today, internet parenting blogs about you need to do this, you need to do that, the high cost of many elements of parenthood, including stable housing, education, after-school programs, everything and anything that parents hear that's necessary. This impacts someone's self-efficacy. So if they can't afford a home, they have a lower perception of their own capacity, their own capability to raise their kids and to really imprint on their kids in a positive way. So many policy avenues really need to look at improving the material conditions for parents that would improve their own estimations of how they would be able to raise their kids.
Great. What specific policy levers, this is kind of another open question, but Dr. Wilcox and Katie, I'm curious for your thoughts, through tax, welfare, education, housing, could make marriage and family formation more attainable for working class Americans?
So I think there are really, a number of things we could say on this particular question, but I would just hit two issues quickly. One is that right now, a lot of our means-tested programs end up penalizing marriage, working class families, and probably the biggest program that's cause for concern here is Medicaid. And what we see is that, in the broader population, there are a fair number of couples with young children who are cohabiting. and mom is on Medicaid and the kids are on Medicaid, but they're not getting married for fear of losing Medicaid in terms of just how their income is coming in, and if they were to get married and kind of count his income, they would be losing access to Medicaid, which would be a big hit for them financially. So I think we have to think about, are there ways that we can kind of reform our means-tested programs and policies so that we're not discouraging marriage. And right now it's really hitting working class couples, just given the way the income thresholds are set up, especially hard. So I think that's one issue we could tackle. I think the second issue, and this is more of a kind of a Texas-specific issue, is doing more to think about ways to make it easy to build single-family housing and townhomes affordably. So having smaller lots, having less regulations, giving builders and families, more flexibility in terms of, when they're building on the front end, or if they want to add something later on, like add grandmother's apartment in the backyard kind of thing. Just kind of giving both, again, builders and families more flexibility in building so as to maximize, our housing options. And that's, I think, a big factor in kind of encouraging young adults to not only to get married, but especially to go ahead and start having the kids that they would like to have.
And kind of in that same vein, Katie, I'm curious for kind of your feedback. I know that you mentioned that your team is very centered kind of around reevaluating the use of the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, which comes down as a block grant from the federal government. When you and your team were reviewing the most recent audit of that program, what were some of the deficiencies that you noted, or ways in which maybe it could be used better?
Thank you. We combed through the recent Texas audit of the TANF program, and there are a couple of themes that kept coming up as we reviewed the program and that reviewed the audit. And the first is kind of the lack of central oversight. There's no one agency that's in charge of the spending. The money comes through 4 different state agencies across 19 programs, and they don't really communicate necessarily particularly well with one another. There's no, because there's no lead agency, there's no strategic planning, no single goal that they're all striving for, kind of to reduce poverty or get families into the workforce, which is the intended purpose of the program. And so, there's just, they're not pulling in the same direction. That's the first thing to note. The second thing is that it's quite, the spending, the state TANF spending in Texas is quite reactive. So most of the money, 70% or more, is spent in child welfare, sort of after families are falling apart. And that's an allowable use of the TANF funds, but it's not really the intended purpose of the TANF funds, which are to get needy families out of kind of off the roll of the dole, off the roll, the welfare rolls, into work, into marriage, using these, using work, time-limited cash benefits, and marriage to kind of promote family wellness, healthy family formation. And so instead we're spending it after families have fallen apart in sort of in a reactive way. So I think there's room for that, for proactive, preventative spending. And we see that in other states are working on that, but in Texas we're sort of on the spending it downstream.
I'm curious, based in that answer, you mentioned other states are utilizing this fund. Could you tell us a little bit more about where that's happening and what particularly they are doing that is so effective?
Well, TANF is very flexible. So each state has its own way of spending its TANF dollars. And some states are really interested in the fatherhood side of things. And so we see Tennessee and Florida are really kind of pursuing that to get fathers more engaged. There are 4 purposes of TANF, and 3 of the 4 mention families and mention healthy family formation. So there's a lot of room for that kind of programming and spending and policies. 2 states, Oklahoma in particular, and also Utah, have marriage initiatives, statewide marriage initiatives, and they use their TANF dollars as well as other funding streams to support education, relationship education programs and courses and curriculum, and trying to get it throughout their population. And Utah does it through their extension, Utah State University Extension System. They have a huge also online presence with all sorts of resources online. The Oklahoma model is a little different. They've taken one curriculum and kind of revamped it and tried to get it into as many populations, into as many classrooms, into as many kind of touch points with their citizens. So there's a prison version. There's a version for folks trying to get on the get into TANF. There's a version for high school for middle school kids. There's if you want to get married, you get a reduction in your marriage license if you take a course like this. So they're trying to really get it out into the community. They offer it free for pastors and community leaders so they can bring it into their communities. So there are innovative ways that several states are, and different approaches that different states have to kind of support healthy family formation that we can look to.
In kind of a different vein, Dr. Rolandi, when we're thinking about this effort to kind of push families in the right direction, we've been talking about kind of the government efforts, but are there partnerships either in public, private, community, faith-based that are showing particular promise kind of in the space of family formation?
I mean, the word partnership maybe is the one that throws me off a bit, but like definitely there are great initiatives. And when I say I'm honored to direct the institute I direct, I'm speaking the truth. So I think that the cultural formation one can do, and let me say this, one should do. So I understand that for people, I would say probably over 50, talking about what it means to be human sounds like, I mean, seriously, like, do we need programs doing that? But the answer is yes. Institutes that are private organizations where high school age children and college age children can go and think about what life is about, what I want to accomplish by the time I'm 50 and before the end of my days here. It's absolutely fundamental. I would say this also, the more one talks to younger people, the more, unless they are, coming from amazing family and maybe homeschooled, but the vast majority of young people do not even take the time to think about the kind of questions that talking about family and marriage implies. So if one asks, some random young person about why they think a particular age is the right one to get married, about why they think that they should or will not have children, there is absolute no answer. That it's probably the first time they're reflecting about this. So what we have seen working, because we have success stories, because some of the people that are attending our programs, not only they get married and have children, but they are a great, good influence on others. So there needs to be an investment in cultural initiatives, because policy cannot do the job on its own. And there would be nothing, from my perspective, more dangerous than having people get married without understanding what the person is, because marriage can go wrong not only with divorce, but it can go wrong in many, many other ways. So, did I answer your question?
Yes,
yeah.
That was great. And that actually kind of transitions us into another really important topic that we wanted to take the time to talk about today, which is kind of that intersection of culture and policy in the context of something that has been called the success sequence. Dr. Wilcox, could you kind of kick us off by giving us a little bit of background on what we're talking about when we mention the success sequence, and then what kind of value it might add?
So the success sequence is this idea, and it's been articulated by a wide range of different scholars, including those at Brookings like Bell Sawhill, that if you get at least a high school degree and you work full-time in your 20s and you get married before having your children, your odds of kind of realizing the American dream are markedly higher. And what that means kind of practically, Hannah, is that what we see is that young adults who are doing all three of those steps in terms of education, work, and marriage, about 97% of them are avoiding poverty in their late 20s and in their 30s, and about 86% of them are reaching the middle class or higher. So there's a kind of a pathway to realizing the American dream financially. The success sequence is kind of laying out for young adults. But it's also linked to some other key outcomes, because obviously there's more to life than money. And what we see is that young adults who are following the sequence are markedly happier than their fellow young adults who aren't, and then also less emotionally distressed, and they're forging more stable families. So for instance, young adults who are having their kids in marriage are much more likely to be together in their 30s. than young adults who are having kids outside of marriage would be kind of, one example of how they're about twice as likely to be, still together as a family. So these different steps in terms of education, work, and marriage are linked to a wide range of financial, emotional, and family outcomes that we think are valuable and which should be kind of conveyed more clearly and powerfully and persuasively to young adults in middle school and high school, and then just more broadly speaking. And we think that Texas schools could be doing this, and there also could be some kind of effort on social media today too to kind of communicate the value of the success sequence to, again, really teenagers and young adults here in Texas, for instance.
I think kind of branching off of that, curious for your thoughts, Dr. Wilcox and Dr. Orlandi, on what you might say to someone who maybe can buy into the idea of marriage or might go through the success sequence, but maybe sees it as something that is either a product of great sacrifice that they're not willing to make, or maybe is out of their reach just in a financial sense, or it exists as a luxury good. How would you kind of soothe that fear, or how do you respond to a culture that may be maintaining that?
I think on the, I think that the sort of the education threshold is simply a high school degree, so that's a pretty low threshold. Although I would frankly encourage young adults either to get a college degree or to get some kind of vocational training, so they have some kind of distinctive skill that they can bring into labor force. But the standard is just a high school degree, which I think is a pretty low bar. And then the next bar is kind of working full time in your 20s, and that can be challenging for some young adults, especially if they're working in the food sector or in the retail sector today, to be honest. And so we have to think about kind of helping them understand, how they can kind of move up in those sectors to, the level where they can be employed full time. But that's certainly, I think, for most young adults, doable. And then when it comes to getting married, that can be a challenge in terms of kind of finding someone who is both appealing, attractive, and has the requisite character to be worthy of getting married. But I think for most of us, if you kind of make the effort to kind of get out there and put yourself out there, you can find that person. And especially the idea with the success sequence is you need to get married before having kids. And so if you're at the place, obviously, somewhere you're potentially having kids, we would sort of say you need to kind of go back and make sure that this is the kind of person who is who would be worthy of marrying, and to marry them before you're having kids with them. So.
Yeah, I smiled because we had this conversation with a student yesterday, trying, to convince him to, get married. But he did mention there is still an existing social stigma about getting married young that is hard to stand against, right? So we're surrounded by older people. They are surrounded by older people telling them, no, think about your future first. This is too soon. So maybe for people in our circles, the success sequence is obvious. It's not out there. The message is still, and I've recently heard a young woman telling me that she reads in studies that I have no clue where they are, but to her, they're the most, that women are happier if they're single and childless. So I was surprised that there are such studies out there, because all my studies seem to show the opposite, right? But so there needs to be there needs to be way more panels, but way more occasions where this kind of information gets, spreads out. But the other thing also that I would like to say is that a way to encourage young people is to say the success sequence works, and I'm gonna make someone laugh here, if it's a sequence. If they stop at some point, it's gonna get harder and harder. And it gets harder and harder because not only, there's no right spouse around. I don't know that that's so much a problem as the problem is true marriage, like parenting, is dying to self, is making sacrifices that one doesn't want to make, and it gets harder and harder once one gets used to a life on their own, right? So one metaphor I've come up with, to describe it's like gaining 1 pound every year you live on your own, and then having to lose them all. It's going to be way more complicated than just doing things earlier in life. Yeah.
Dr. Wilcox, you've noted that divorce is down and intact families are rebounding. What's driving this shift, and what can we learn from it?
Right. So again, I think, certainly many people that I speak with have a kind of a sense that things are getting worse and worse on the family front, that 1 and 2 marriages in America end in divorce. And that's the way it was kind of in the 70s and 1980s, right? It was kind of in that, very high levels of divorce. And there was kind of this breakdown in marriage for our kids. But since about 2014, as I wrote about in The Atlantic, in the September issue of The Atlantic, we have been seeing kind of this, what Carl Caton, who's sitting in the back there, calls a kind of marriage renaissance unfolding for at least families with kids. So that, again, sort of like this relentless increase in family instability has stopped around 2014, and more kids are being raised by their own married parents. So I think what's happening here in part is that marriage and family life have become more selective for the kinds of people who are either more religious or more conservative and or who are more educated and affluent. And so those kinds of people have more of the financial resources and the cultural resources to succeed when it comes to getting married, staying married, and raising kids together. So that, on the one hand, is good for the kids and the families who are experiencing this kind of marriage renaissance, but of course, we're also concerned too for all those Americans who aren't religious, aren't conservative, and aren't, in that more college-educated or more affluent, bracket. And so I think the challenge for us going forward is how do we extend the benefits of marriage and family life to Americans who don't share our political and religious commitments? And how do we also kind of extend marriage to working class and poor Americans, and recognize that there was a point in American history where there weren't major class divides in America. There weren't major racial divides in marriage in America. There weren't major cultural divides when it came to marriage. So I think we can work for a society that, as we move forward, kind of embraces marriage, in a more thoroughgoing way across class lines and across cultural lines. That's, I think, one of the big challenges going forward.
In kind of that vein, how can we ensure that conversations about marriage and family don't remain abstract? So how can we kind of think about these things in the context of policies that connect to people's real sense of being able to achieve these tenets of the success sequence and just flourish as individuals, as members of a marriage or a family or a community? Katie, maybe starting with you, and then perhaps Noah, and then if anyone else wants to take it.
We are at our organization, we recently interviewed some folks who are teaching the success sequence here in Texas schools, and one of the gentlemen who's kind of training the trainers, he has to kind of go back to the beginning about marriage, and it's you might be happier and healthier if you're married. It's better for you, kind of as an individual, before you even start thinking about your children that you may want to have. And so I think we have to, as Noah was saying, we have kind of in some communities sort of lost the idea of marriage. We really need to reintroduce it from the beginning. I mean, if it's not modeled, if you don't see it, it's hard to know how to do it. And we can't make any assumptions about the messages, young people are getting, in the society. So I think the success sequence is great, and just all the basics of your research are so important. Just not even about poverty in the future, and obviously your success is important, but every aspect of that success, and really introducing it at a young age. So we do see some states that are have the success sequence has recently been passed in some states that it's going to be required in schools, and in Texas, I don't think it's the case just yet, but maybe soon.
Yeah, I just want to really echo those statements and those sentiments, because it's really easy to fall into a malaise when, for the past 2,500 years, the cultural assumptions about marriage have been that it's two people who consent and have kids together, and you're raised by those people. Many people don't even take the time to reflect on what marriage means or what family means. They have bad conceptions of marriage and family. And then, so to bring things down from the abstract for those people, I think it's really important that they're met where they're at. And that's through community interventions, through community support programs, through their church, through religious communities, through social groups, through the peers their own age, through mentorship. Again, just to reiterate, one of the biggest negative hampers on self-efficacy, either as a parent or as a spouse, is not having anyone to rely upon to learn from. So these people don't have anyone to rely upon to learn from. They don't have anyone to hear them out as to how they got to where they were, how they gained these attitudes or dispositions about marriage and family that may make them feel like it's unattainable or not even for them. I mean, if they don't have anyone to go to, you know, how can they be helped? How can they, you know, they don't want to be alone, that's for sure, you know. So it's important that communities really get involved, and that even in the policy-making process, that we understand that a lot of people have these dispositions, these ideas, because of a variety of factors, and that it's important for us, again, to meet them where they are and to understand how they got there and how, you know, they might be able to see a better, more fuller, more comprehensive conception of marriage and family.
I think we also have to think about the role of technology in all this too. I mean, I think we both hinted at the way in which technology is kind of playing a major role in Americans' lives and our kids' lives as well. And it's not an entirely negative role, obviously, but often it's playing a pretty profoundly corrosive role in people's lives and kids' lives. And so both in terms of degrading people's capacity to learn how to be good at socializing, it's also kind of, you know, there's an opportunity cost. The more time you're spending on a screen, less time you're spending, you know, in person socializing or being involved in some kind of religious activity or, you know, doing some kind of local sport, whatever it might be. And then we're also seeing too how social media is polarizing young adults. It's pushing young women to the left culturally and politically, and pushing young men to the right oftentimes, and therefore creating a kind of newer ideological chasm between young women and young men in ways that obviously are not conducive to, you know, getting married and having kids. So I think the more that Texas can do to protect kids from big tech when it comes to social media, when it comes to chatbots, when it comes to, obviously worked on the issue of pornography here in Texas, but just kind of just being aware of the way in which there are all sorts of new pressures that are kind of operating on our kids and us as adults as well. And the more that we can do from a policy perspective, but also from a personal and civic perspective to try to figure out new ways to protect our kids and help them to grow up in the real world rather than the virtual world, will then equip them with the skills and the orientation to be better friends, better boyfriends, better girlfriends, and better spouses. But I also want to just, as a sort of, you know, additional caveat there, to encourage those among us who are good at communicating online to do our part, you know, to talk about the value of marriage and family and the virtues that make for good marriages and good families, because it's obviously the case that a lot of people, both adults and teens, are getting a lot of their messaging and thinking about love, marriage, and family from online sources. And so we need to make sure that there are people out there who are doing a good job of conveying the truth about the value of marriage and family, as opposed to people like, for instance, Andrew Tate.
Thank you. With that, we'll kind of move into the Q&A portion of this. We have a tradition here at TPPF, and it is that every question that is asked actually ends in a question mark. So if this is a time where you have something to ask one of our panelists, please raise your hand, and a mic will come to you.
Hello, thank you. I had a question regarding economic hardships for American families in the U.S. The last administration pushed heavy taxes, but it's not just coming from the federal government, it's also state taxes that are crushing families. And so in order to get married, you know, you need to court your, you know, spouse, and you know, the man needs to make a lot of money, a decent amount in order to get married. And then, you know, a woman wants to have a house in order to raise a family, and it's very expensive to buy a house. So what are your thoughts on like the economics of the situation? Like a lot of families don't have a lot of money right now, and it's all these taxes are crushing families. Are there any policies that are trying to incentivize like more tax credits for solving this problem?
So certainly we've kind of just pushed through a modest expansion of the child tax credit, you know, up in Congress recently, which President Trump signed. So that certainly is going to make it a little bit easier to afford the costs of raising kids. So that's, I think, one response to your question. But I think there certainly could be more opportunities to think about other things that we could do on the financial front. Everything from like a baby bonus, for instance, would be one idea, to thinking about, maybe the property taxes here in Texas would be kind of calibrated to take into account whether or not people are raising, kids under the age of 18 in the household, or to think about kind of utilities, for instance, as well. So in terms of water and electricity. So what we're seeing actually in Europe, for instance, play out as they are facing an even much more severe demographic crisis than we are here in the States, is that localities are now beginning to think about even newer ways that they can kind of make it easier to afford a family. And so they're thinking about and pursuing policies that address things like the cost of electricity, water, and then whatever equivalent they have to real estate taxes. So I think those kinds of things should be on the table as we kind of go forward and face the fact that here, even in Texas, you have a below replacement rate fertility of 1.8 kids per month on average, which is below the replacement rate of 2.1 babies per month on average. And so if you want to kind of encourage people to maintain not just the sort of like replacement rate, but also to kind of give people the opportunity to have the kids that they would like to have, and most Americans would still like to have more than 2 kids, what are some of the policies we can do to make it financially more feasible to have those kids and to raise that family. So these are the kinds of policies that might be helpful.
If I may add a completely different front to the answer, from a completely different angle, is there's the cultural side. And so we were speaking earlier about this. So the expectation today of the young people, including those in the room, is that you're going to have a nice car and a nice house. And you're going to go to expensive dinners, including when courting. This is not true. And technology is still to blame. This we can blame it even on TV and TV series that made us think that that's the way a family started. But right now, also, technology is the best way to compare ourselves. If you have a family, you should not compare yourself to someone who's single and just thinking about their own single trip somewhere. So in that sense, this is this thing we have in our hands is also making us perceive that we're not as good as we should be, and the date that I just brought my girlfriend on, is not as cool as it could have been. But that's the work each one of us has to do on ourselves, like lower my expectation and lower what I think I should be doing for this person, and probably even having very frank conversations about it and saying, if we do want to have a family, we need to accept that we're going to live in a small apartment for a little while, maybe for longer than a little while,
If I may, just real quick on that point as well, there was a study a couple of years ago of university students and assessing their relationship self-efficacy, their views towards marriage, and their marriage readiness. And the study found that ideas that they had sourced from the internet and from their peers about unrealistic expectations for a marriage or for a relationship, or expectations that are not intrinsically necessary to marriage, actually had lowered their own self-efficacy. And with that lowered self-efficacy, when they enter into a marriage, they're not going to act in a way that they may actually be able to fulfill. So they have, such a lower appraisal of their actual capability, or a lower appraisal relative to some standard that may not be necessary. Again, a huge house, 2 luxury cars, expensive dinners, those are the keys to marriage. They're an essential to marriage. You may get that notion that they are. Young people may get that notion that it's essential. And it's not, but it really can put a hamper on their disposition and effectively their capability when they are married.
Hannah?
Thank you all for being here. All of these kids who are at the beginning of what we hope is this process of graduating from high school, working, getting married, and then having kids are being bombarded with messages from Hollywood and the entertainment industry at large that is diametrically opposed to everything that you guys have said. How do we overcome that? And is there any way to start a process of displacing the current entertainment industry with something that actually has values that can be instilled in an entertaining and interesting way that will catch kids' attention and start shifting that culture through that method? I'm not sure if that's a coherent question, but
That's great. Thank you. I will say that, and Brad and I were talking about this earlier, I feel like we're at an interesting moment culturally where we kind of have a reemergence, and it's very quiet. I think that you're right. The large portion of noise from Hollywood is relatively pro-independence, and in doing so, anti-marriage, anti-family, anti-responsibility in that sense. But I do think it's interesting, and it sounds very trivial, but celebrities like Taylor Swift getting engaged and writing songs about the importance of marriage on her most recent album, and even artists like Charlie XCX getting married is meaningful. It shows that there is a value in the institution. And I think that kind of taking those moments, cultural moments, and pushing them forward is kind of the next step. But I think, Dr. Wilcox, you probably also have some thoughts on this as well.
So again, I mean, and to acknowledge that the kind of the technological revolution that I've been talking about, primarily in a disparaging way, does have its, you know, its bright sides, obviously. And so I think one clear point is that sort of like the monopoly that sort of Hollywood had on sort of like entertainment is over, and the monopoly that the mainstream media had on sort of how we think about what's happening in society oftentimes is over. So there are now, I think, many more opportunities for kind of people who are living, you know, more intentionally as parents to sort of point their kids to higher quality, pro-family entertainment that's accessible through streaming platforms and other platforms. And now there are many more, you know, podcasts and news sites that are very family friendly. So I think we can kind of recognize that on the upside, the digital revolution that's sort of taken place has opened up the kind of cultural arena in ways that allow us to kind of steer our kids and our teenagers oftentimes in a better direction. We should try to figure out, you know, kind of how we can do that, and to sort of continue to sort of support those parts of the culture that are more family friendly.
Yeah, the only thing that I would like to add is that I wouldn't trust celebrities to be models. No, seriously, like, we do not know, even when we have a great religious leader, we want someone to keep him, you know, in check. I don't trust Taylor Swift. I don't know what she's going to do in 10 years, in 15 years, in 20 years. Do I want that to be the model for my kids? No. So I think that one answer would be thinking about the past. There was one TV, and everyone was watching the same TV. That would be a very family-friendly idea, right? So I need to compromise. I need to make an agreement with my family. I need to sacrifice one day, the other day you will. Isn't that a way to build character too, that is gonna then help me? And you can do it with your friends on campus, right? Instead of picking your own pro-family material on your phone, just put down your own laptop, find 5 or 10 friends, and create a group that you're gonna watch movies with. And it's gonna be pedagogically way more important.
Hi, I'm Jeff Morgan. No, I really appreciate a lot of the stuff that you've talked about. Throughout history, we've seen a lot of socialists that have talked about children belonging to the state. And when you get to 1884, you had Frederick Engels writing about the origins of the families. And what they've done, they looked at the family as being an instrument of oppression. And they wanted to make easy divorce. You've talked a little bit about easy divorce and stuff like that. What took place in the Bolshevik Revolution under Lenin was they basically destroyed the family. And when you look at what we have in Texas today, as far as divorce law is concerned, we have the perfect embodiment of what Engels and Marx and Lenin wanted to put into place. I hear people talking about I want to get married, but the first thing I have to do is say, how do I protect myself? And I don't know how many of you have been to family courts to see what goes on, but it's horrible. So I guess with regard to policy suggestions, I'm advocating for the abolishment of unilateral, no-fault divorce, subjective divorce, and I don't see how, and I'd like to hear your feedback, how we can really be encouraging people to marry when they know that when they enter into marriage, under the current law system as it is right now, we're almost encouraging them to play Russian roulette with 3 chambers loaded. Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
Thank you for that question and that thought. I know that that's a little bit out of the bounds of kind of the discussion that we had today. By way of a very brief response, Brad, do you have any cursory thoughts on that?
No, I certainly think that kind of divorce law reform is part and parcel of the kinds of policy steps that need to take place to give people more security about kind of what their marriage offers them, what kind of security it provides them, legally and otherwise moving forward. So there's no doubt that in many states we've kind of come to a place where people are quite vulnerable to be, to being abandoned, by their spouse, and then to be treated unfairly too by the court system. So I don't think we're going to go back to the fault-based model that kind of, we saw prior to the 1970s in most states. But we could go forward to making some reforms that would sort of, I think, strengthen and stabilize family law and give marriage more kind of power in people's lives. And so, for instance, thinking about things like having, it depends on the state, but having a waiting period would be, I think, one step. Having a presumption of a kind of 50-50 custody would be another step to make marriage more valuable. And rethinking, how property division sort of plays out depending upon how the divorce itself happened would be the kinds of steps that we could take to, I think, make marriage stronger and to give people greater confidence in institutions. So, and there's certainly, I would expect in the next year or two, a number of kind of state-based efforts on this front to kind of move away from, I think, some of the extremes that we saw in the wake of the no-fault divorce revolution of the late 60s and the 1970s. But it's important, too, to note that divorce is down markedly since 1980. So it's the divorce rate's down 40% since 1980. And in my piece for The Atlantic, just mentioned that we have kind of seen divorce come down from that kind of 1 in 2 risk of divorce, where it was about 50% of marriages ending in divorce in the late 70s and early 1980s, to a point now where it's about 40% of marriages ending divorce. That's still, in my estimation, too high, but we are projecting to a continuing decline in the divorce rate as well. So it's not the case that it's like Russian roulette in that sense. I mean, most marriages that are formed today are going to go the distance, and there are things that you can do, and I talk about them in my book, Get Married, that kind of further reduce your risk of ending up in divorce court. But I would agree with you that, divorce as it's now playing out in many states is often unjust to the party who wishes to remain in the marriage and with the kids and the family. And we need to figure out ways to strengthen the institution going forward.
Thank you all for those questions. Just due to the limits of time, we're going to have to close it here. But I will say that either via the QR code in your program or even on the table before you leave outside, we've made some resources from some of our panelists available, including the document that was done by Katie and her team on reimagining TANF, and we would encourage you to check those out. With that, would you please join me in thanking our panelists for their time?